I'm really excited to have Dr. Liz Marnik here today. She's a science communicator and immunologist, and she really works in that intersection between public trust, science, and health. And she earned her PhD in genetics from Tufts University. And Frederick and I actually met her while she was doing her postdoc at MDIBL with Dustin Updike. And so she might get into a little bit more of her story. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, thanks for coming, Liz, and go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me. I'm always excited to talk to a new group about science communication, and I definitely have an appreciation for what you all do. When I did my postdoc with Dustin, I did a lot of microscopy. And unfortunately, Hannah and Frederick were just starting when I was leaving, so we didn't get to overlap as much because I would have loved to be able to use more of their tools. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction, a little bit more to who I am. So I'm a mom of two. I'm a wife, I'm a runner, I'm a reader, and as Hannah mentioned, I am a PhD trained scientist. My research really focused for my PhD on using genetic tools. So I used knockout mice to study the role of CD4 T cells in the immune response. So my work was very heavily immunology, and I used genetics as a tool to ask those types of questions. And then I did my postdoc with Dustin Updike, and then I've done a lot of different things since then, but I now have completely left bench research. And I recently also I came after my postdoc, I went back to the lab and was director of science education and outreach for them at the MDI Biological Laboratory. But I left that job in February to become executive director of the Evidence Collective, and I'll tell you more about what we do in a second. I'm also the chief scientific officer for an nonprofit called Those Nerdy Girls, where we translate science and public health in plain language for the public. The interesting part of my background, which I talk about only because it really informs the way in which I communicate science, particularly in this moment, is that I was raised in an anti-science, anti-vaccine household. So I was not vaccinated until I was 23, right before I went to start graduate school, and I knew I was probably going to be studying the immune system because for my undergraduate work, I studied graft versus host disease in mice and loved it. So I recently was able to write a New York Times guest essay about this experience and how I changed my mind and how it in fact impacts my science communication work. And the image of that is here on the screen. And if anyone doesn't have a New York Times subscription but wants to read it, I can drop a gift link in at the end. But I really started going down this pathway of public science communication in 2020. We all know what happened in March of 2020, right? That COVID-19 became a thing. And at that time, my personal and my professional life really started to collide. I started seeing on social media my parents, my friends that I grew up with, my family members spreading false information about COVID-19 in ways that I thought were very dangerous to themselves and to other people. So I felt a responsibility to, try to translate what was happening for them. And I started doing that on my personal social media, my personal Facebook and all of those things. And then people started wanting to share it. And then I decided I didn't want it shared off my personal. So that's where I started a public Instagram account called Science with Liz. And I also have a Substack newsletter called From the Science Classroom. But now, as I mentioned, I am the executive director of an organization called the Evidence Collective. It was co-founded by Caitlin Jetelina, who writes the Substack Your Local Epidemiologist, and Jessica Steyer, who runs Unbiased Science. Both are really great science communication platforms to follow if you don't already. And we are a coalition of over 30 subject matter experts. So that means we all have PhDs, MDs, MPHs, DOs. We all have expertise in different areas of science and public health, but we also are actively communicating science to the public in different platforms. Last year, we had a combined reach of over 11 billion people over the course of a year, which is a lot of people, and we have over 10 million social media followers combined. And we really are focused on three main buckets. One is increasing the speed of which we respond when things like, gutting NIH happen or vaccine policy, and also improving coordination so that people are seeing, similar messages from multiple voices in ways that they can understand. We also are doing a lot of work right now to break echo chambers because unfortunately we all live in a very echo chamber rich society. Our algorithms are all feeding me very different information than they're feeding you or your friend next door. And that unfortunately creates silos where oftentimes the people who need to understand why science benefits them don't necessarily see that information. So we are working with mom influencers, dad influencers, faith leaders, community workers to try to get the importance of science and public health messages out into those audiences that traditionally maybe wouldn't follow a scientist or a public health leader. So now I want to talk a little bit about why does science communication matter? So there's a lot of data from social science and psychology that tells us there right now in this moment, there is a really big gap between science and society. We can call this psychological distance is the official term for it. So what that means is that for the normal person you might encounter on the sidewalk if you're out for a walk, they don't necessarily understand why and how science benefits them. They might unconsciously right, we most of us have cell phones these days, and of course science helped bring us cell phones and airplanes and medications that so many of us take, but oftentimes people don't make the connection between those things that are tangibly benefiting them and the fact that science and investment in science and research actually helped bring that forward. So the work of science communication is really thinking about how can we help narrow the gap between science and society, because research shows when we do that, people are much more likely to want to support science through funding and, doing evidence-based medical interventions and those types of things. And there's a lot of ways in which we can think about reducing that gap, and I'll give you some examples and then we'll talk a little bit more. But one kind of example is just getting out into your community. So you could think about creative ways of like, you all probably have beautiful microscope images. I know Hannah and Frederick do. And think about how could you put an art show in your library? That's one great way. Or maybe you give a public talk in a library, or you go talk to a group of kids at school, or as you're sitting next to somebody in the bar, you tell them what you do and why you care so much about it. All of those things don't seem, like a lot, but over time, they actually help reduce this gap between science and society. So science communication matters for a lot of reasons. It matters because being able to communicate your science is important for getting research funding. It matters for grant writing. It also matters for just public willingness to fund scientific research and to support scientific research. We also see right now that there is declining trust in scientists and institutions, and being able to interact and communicate to the public is important for that. And then there's also this piece of health equity that I'm not going to touch too much on for this audience, but who has access to scientific information and what they can then do with that information is very important when we think about things like being able to access medical care. So this slide is showing you a few different things. So one on the far left, Peter Hotez does a great work really at the intersection of looking at the increasing anti-science sentiments that are happening in this moment. He wrote this really great book. It is kind of scary to read, but I think it's really important for us to realize that we are seeing this uprising of anti-science sentiments. And this is not just happening in the US, it's actually happening globally, though, of course, what we see happening in the US is a little bit more extreme than we're seeing in other countries so far. We also can see data from Pew that Pew does a lot of polling data, and they're seeing that overall there is a decline in trust of scientists. And it's actually greater for those who identify as Republican than those who identify as Democrat. On the other hand, there's actually some literature that shows that scientists who engage with society actually perform better academically. So what that means is they're better able to get funding, they're better able to publish papers. There's a whole host of things that they tend to do more of than their counterparts who don't engage with the public. And if you think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you can tell a story and explain what it is that you do and why it's important to somebody who is not a scientist, you likely are also going to be good at doing that to funders, because it is obviously a different kind of audience, but a very similar skill. And then, of course, we're in this era of misinformation where as quick as click of a button, people can spread all sorts of things that are not true about science. And that means that now more than ever, engaging with the public and doing science communication is important. There's also this unfortunate reality, again, from psychology and social science that tell us that the more somebody sees something, the more likely they are to believe that it's true. This is called the illusory truth effect. And this matters a lot when we think again about misinformation in this moment. The more people say that, NIH spending is wasteful, the more likely people are to think that that is true. And this is why bringing counter narratives that explain why NIH research is important, why it's worth investing in that type of thing, getting that message out in front of the public is really important to try to counter all of those things that they're going to be seeing by individuals who are spreading that false information. And this is true for all sorts of topics you can imagine. I do a lot of work around vaccine communication, and it's especially true also in that setting. So we're really living in an interesting paradox where now more than ever, there's more information available at people's fingertips with, technology, with AI, for better, for worse, with social media. All of that means that there's more information. Of course, not all of that information is accurate, but there's a lot of information that people have to tease through. At the same time, we're seeing that there is declining trust in science and experts and overall in institutions. And when we look at what we need to do in response to this, we need to remember something that can be really hard for scientists and even me who, changed my mind so dramatically on my beliefs. I had to remind myself of this when I started doing public science communication. It's that facts alone don't change minds. And there's tons of science that actually backs this up. So, as much as we, as scientists and as people doing lab work, as much as we value data and facts, that actually isn't necessarily enough to motivate people to value science or to change their behaviors in response to the information that you're providing them. I'm going to share a few things that actually do help. And this is not to say that facts are not important. They are important, but they're not enough on their own to necessarily have the impact that you want. The other thing I like to remind people, especially when I'm talking to people within, science and institutions, is that we're really living in an interesting time where multiple things are true at once. It is true that the systems we had were not perfect, and we need to acknowledge that they were not perfect. We say that science serves all of us, but the reality is that it doesn't equally serve everyone depending on the access that they have. Some people can't afford insulin. Yes, science gave us insulin, but not everyone can equally access its benefits for a whole host of systemic issues. The other aspect of that, though, right, is that abandoning these systems entirely is dangerous. And the things that we're seeing happen to NIH and to NSF and to science overall in the United States, that's not the solution either. Both of these things can be true at once. So when we think about moving forward into, hopefully a better future, hopefully rebuilding after the dust settles from what's happening right now, we need to really think about how can we build in the intersection of these two things, keeping what was useful, keeping what was great, but also building new systems that potentially serve more people over time. The other thing I like to remind everyone is that we are all trusted messengers. So this image that you're looking at is from the 2022 Trusted Messenger Study, and you can read the whole study if you Google it. And this is looking at how people kind of think about making decisions. This might be the decision for who to vote for, the decision of what policies to support, whether or not they're going to take a medication, those types of things. There are people in this outer circle that help you become aware that an issue is actually even there in the first place. Then there's the bubble of people who provide information to you that you may then use to make a subsequent decision. And then there's the people who actually help individuals make those decisions. And every single place within this process, partners, family, and friends are important. So regardless of what hat you wear as a day job, you probably have friends and family and a partner maybe that, you are a trusted messenger to. But then when we look more specifically at these categories, we see that scientists, teachers, and professors show up both in the places where people provide valuable information and in the places where people are actually then making decisions. The scary part of this is that if you look at who's actually helping people make decisions, we also see things like social media friends, which, depending on who your social media friend is, not necessarily always a good thing. Same for local journalists or national journalists. Depending on what information those people are providing, that actually could be a bad thing or it could potentially be a good thing. So, take home from this is that all of you who are listening to this right now likely are a trusted messenger to somebody. That means that you have an important role to play, even if you never get in front of a stage, in helping, have conversations about the importance of science overall. So hopefully that gave you a few pieces of information to really hammer home the point that communicating science is critically important. But how you communicate science also really makes a difference. Not all methods are going to be equally effective for all people. I don't have tons of time with everyone right now. I will leave my email for people who maybe want to follow up and ask more questions, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. But one thing I like to remind people is you do also have to think about who is your audience. Who are you trying to communicate with? Because you should also be changing the way in which you communicate depending on what your target group of audience is. The other thing I like to remind people is that it is possible to balance accuracy with understandability. Oftentimes, when I'm talking to people, people struggle because they feel like they have to dumb it down. And I like to turn that back on its head and say, we are not dumbing it down. We are making sure that the people who are helping fund our research through their tax dollars understand why it's important and how it's being used. And they deserve to understand that because their tax dollars are helping to support our efforts. So there are ways in which you can maintain accuracy and still make sure that the people you are communicating to understand what it is that you're actually doing and why it's actually important. And one of the ways you can do this is really thinking about what is your key message. So, what is the one thing you want your community to understand about your research or your work and why it matters? And if you can distill it down into like one or 2 points, then from there, it's much more easy to tailor it to the audience that you're trying to reach. Oftentimes, when people really struggle to communicate what they're doing and why it's important to a group of people, it's because they're trying to get into the nitty-gritty. And when you strip all of that away, it's often not those nitty-gritty details are really important when you're communicating to other scientists, but they're not necessarily important when you're communicating to the public. So when you're thinking about this, consider what is it that your audience actually needs to know. It will be different depending on if you're talking to the public or a group of kids or policy makers or funders. And then think about what is it that they care about. Because ultimately, framing information in a way that resonates with what they care about will make them care more about what you are communicating to them. The other thing is thinking about the jargon that we use. As scientists, as people who are trained in very technical skills, it is second nature to us to just use jargon. My favorite example of this is my husband and I do a lot of meal prepping. And one time, a couple years ago, I told him I was aliquoting out my meals. And he was like, what is aliquoting? And I'm like, what do you mean? How do you not know what aliquoting is? For me, it was such an obvious word to use, but it was jargon. So what I want to do is I'm going to take a second and I want you guys to think about what are some words of jargon you use to explain your work. And I'm going to have you guys drop them into the chat. I love all these. Some of the options are core facility, proliferate, microscopist, segmentation, stub, imaging, analytical imaging, conjugation, fixative, fluorescent and antibody staining, LUT, used as a word, but it's actually an acronym. We are great for that in science. A lot of acronyms used as words. Yeah, these are all really great examples. Minus 80s, convolve, yep. All of these are really great examples of jargon, right? To us, as people who understand what these words mean, it's obvious. We use them probably without thinking. But to the public that we're communicating to, and even possibly to funders, depending on who you're going to for funding, it may not be obvious to them. So what I want you to think about is if you dropped an example in the chat, or even if you didn't want to, that's fine. I want you to now take a second to go back and think about how could you, well, first think about, is this concept important for somebody to know, particularly if you're communicating, let's say, to the public in this example? Is it important for them to know this? And if it is, how can you explain it without using jargon? So I'm going to give you a second, and then I want you to try, you can put it in the chat, thinking of an alternative way to explain the word you gave me without using that word. And sometimes we'll find maybe it was one word and it takes like 2 sentences to explain it without jargon, but that's okay. Yeah, I like these. So proliferate, an alternative might be grow. Convolve means mixed together. Analytical imaging, somebody said using a microscope to do more than just take a picture of the sample, but learn more about its makeup or composition. Hannah said, I take scientific images to better our understanding of blank. I love that. Imaging, taking pictures of small things. I like that. Conjugation is attaching a sensor. I've also used like attaching a marker or a flag. Sometimes that kind of analogy works. A core facility, you might say shared lab. Mechanobiology. I struggle finding a non-jargon version for this field. Yeah, that can be, it can take time and like workshopping to really think through. Proteins have functions in cells and tissues. We can visualize them using antibodies and fluorescent microscopes. Then we can learn more about what the proteins function. So that's a really good one. It still had a few examples of jargon, but you could tease those out more in some more sentences. LUT is lookup table, which is the numbers behind images. Core facility is a cluster of instruments shared by a group of scientists. Yeah, I love all of these. And don't worry, I'm not judging grammar. So what I will say is particularly for when we're thinking about communicating about a core facility, which I know is what many of you do. It is a cluster of instruments shared by a group of scientists. That is true. But then also think about, why is it important that the public knows that a core facility exists? So you might explain that it's instruments shared by multiple labs, but ultimately what they care about is, why is it important to the work that needs to be done, or to, whatever it is that they hope will happen. All right, now I want to ask you guys, I'm giving you two options, option A and option B. I'm going to give you a minute to read both of these options. And then I want you to put in the chat which one you like better, whether you're voting for option A or option B. And option B is getting cut off, so I'm going to fix this for a second. There we go. So go ahead and read these two paragraphs and then tell me in the chat if you prefer A or B. By like, I mean, which one would you rather share with somebody else? I'm being purposely vague. I will break it down more in a moment. Okay, I like how a lot of you said it depended on the audience, and I like how a few of you acknowledged that you preferred A, but maybe that was not the preferred option. Um, okay, so I am going to come back to this in a moment, but first I want to walk you through some data. So the data that I'm going to share with you guys is from an organization called Science Counts. If you're not familiar with them, they're really great. They help think about the ways in which we can communicate the importance of basic science, particularly to the public. And what they did is they did a bunch of US surveys focused on word usages. And, this might seem kind of niche and not important, but we really know that the words we use matter a lot. And they matter for a few reasons. When we use a word, the people that we're using that word with may not understand what we mean, or they may think it means something differently than we mean. So there can be misunderstandings. But then also, unfortunately, people's beliefs and identities and willingness to receive information often is tied to preconceived ideas that they may have or things that they've experienced in the past. So certain words may put up a wall between you and the people you're trying to reach. All right. So first, this is looking specifically at the percentage of Americans who have a positive association with each of the following terms. And if somebody has a positive association with a word, they're more likely to be receptive to the information you're trying to convey. Now, of course, none of these words are bad. It's just things to keep in mind when you're trying to make sure your message resonates and reaches the people you're trying to reach. So at the top are the words that had the best positive association, which are words like discovery. Discovery was very well received by those who, took the poll. Invention and science as well. But on the bottom half of this, we see public investment at the bottom, citizen science at the bottom, publicly funded science at the bottom, and research grants were, kind of in the middle. They then looked at how this segmented across specific groups. So they looked at conservatives, people who self-identified as conservative or people who self-identified as, college educated or high school educated. And what they found was that discovery worked better for all segments of the population, whereas invention, was seemed to be better for those who self-identified as conservative. Technology worked better for college educated. And then we see things like basic and applied research didn't really work well for any segment of the population, probably because they don't actually know what we mean when we say basic versus applied research. So then they looked at what is it that Americans use to communicate what they believe science is versus what they don't think it is. So overall, this polling data found that people think science is a means to an end, a path for a better tomorrow, and a way for young people to serve the greater good. Remember, this is polling the public. Science was not a way to compete, about money or funding, or about looking backwards in the past. Those did not resonate well with those who were polled. So what does this mean? Well, Science Counts put together a recommendation that says that this means that we should use words like science, innovation, and discovery often in our communication to the public, and that nothing is gained by differentiating basic versus applied research. They also say that it is better for the public to present science as something forward motion, where we're working towards this end goal. It might take decades to get there, but we have this forward progress to this ideal destination. Talking about money and competition and past accomplishments did not poll well with the public. Now, of course, if you're talking to funders, that's going to be different. You need to acknowledge past funding. If you're talking to funders, you might need to tell them exactly why you need funding, right? But if we're talking to the public and we want them to understand the value, leaving those things out tends to result in a better receipt of information. They also then polled public versus scientists, and they asked them to describe the word that they feel when they hear, so how they feel when they hear the word science. 56% of the public said that they feel hope. That was their emotion that they identified when they hear science. That was pretty low for scientists. It was only 37%. Versus scientists tended more so to resonate with joy. So this shows that the public really seems, at least 56% of the public, equate science with hope. So that means when we think about talking about science, we can build on this fact that many Americans equate science with hope. The caveat to that is we don't all hope for the same thing. And we have to come to terms with the fact that the public has a very different view of science than we do. Science is often, in the public's mind, judged based on the intended payoff, what we hope to do with the work in the future, not necessarily the credentials of the scientists doing the work or what we've already done in the past. And that can, be a hard balance to think about. So then if I go back to these two examples, many of you were correct. So based on the words that tend to work better for the public, option B was the better option in this scenario. Now, of course, there's never a one size fit all in science communication, no matter how good or how careful you are in communicating science. There will be people who don't like the way you do it. There will be people who don't resonate the exact same way. And it's also important to check your own biases and assumptions. You are not your target audience if you're communicating to the general public. So you may not like option B the best, but it's important to understand why some members of the public may prefer that kind of communication. I will say that option B still has some jargon. So if we ultimately were putting this in front of the public, we would need to remove some of that jargon, but that gives you an example. The other thing I wanted to mention before I open up to questions is the importance of storytelling in science communication. And storytelling can be oral storytelling, it can be written storytelling, but you guys also can tell stories with beautiful images included as well, which is a perk that not all aspects of science have. So this quote I really like because it's from a paper published in 2023 that talks about how many people deny science and reject health recommendations despite there being many facts and statistics to back up the importance. And didactic science and health communication is often dry and relies on the false assumption that people make purely evidence-based decisions. But stories can be powerful tools for capturing attention and evoking emotion. And luckily, we have more data to back this up. So these are two studies that I really like because they have showed that when information is embedded into a story or into a narrative structure where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, it was actually better remembered over time. So if you want people to understand why core facilities are important to fund, embedding that importance into a narrative will help that be remembered longer than if you just say, hey, this is important for X, Y, Z. On the left is a really one of the earliest data sets we have on this from 1969. It was where Bauer and Clark worked with students and they had them memorize words, and they either had them memorize words embedded into a story or just like a random list. And they found over time and, initially, students who had those words in a narrative were able to remember them longer. This other paper on the right shows very similar finding that not only was the people who had the information embedded in a story, not only did they remember it better, but they also remembered it longer. And that's the gray diamonds that you see on the top. The other really interesting thing is this is a preprint that just came out really recently, and I was able to talk to the lead author, and they're doing really great work that shows the importance of storytelling in science communication. But they worked with a group of high school students across all of Kentucky. So they worked with multiple schools across Kentucky, and they split students into two groups. One was a group of high school students that received a storytelling intervention, and one is where they just went through their normal, learning in the traditional high school setting. And what they found is that students who went through this storytelling training were more empathetic towards their classmates and had more empathy towards people with diverse perspectives. And I didn't include the data here, but they also showed that the students who went through the storytelling intervention were more willing to engage with new ideas and to see another person's perspective. So if we're trying to, convince people who maybe don't understand the importance of funding core facilities or funding science in general, then we want them to be willing to engage with a new idea. And this data tells us that embedding it in a story and doing storytelling can be one really effective way of doing that. Interestingly, we can also see this changes health outcomes. So when information is delivered in a story setting, so for example, if we want people to actually do something with our information, if we present the information in a story, they more likely are to do that. So for example, there was one study that had information about the importance of pap smears just in an informational video, and one where the importance of pap smears was communicated via a story. And the group who saw the story were more likely to actually go get the pap smear, which is what you want to happen when you're presenting information. So for example, if you want someone to, call their representative to tell them you want core facilities and science funded, they're more likely to actually do that action if you're embedding the message in a story that will motivate them to then do something. So this is kind of the storytelling framework that I think about when I'm communicating science. Again, I can share my slides with all of you if you want to take this, and I can share some other things I've written about how to do this and the importance of doing this because I know we don't have tons of time. But the very first thing to think about is who is your audience and what is your goal? So what do you want your audience to feel, know, or do differently in response to this information? It may just be you want them to understand what a core facility is and why it's important to the scientific process. And that's a really great goal that you could build off of. You then have to find a hook that can capture a reader or watcher's attention. You guys all have really great hooks. Beautiful images are a great hook to get people interested and engaged in the topic. Like, honestly, that is what I would use for all of you, right? Have your videos or your posts or any type of communication you're doing include those really compelling images because, they inspire awe and amazement. And that's a great hook to then have people think about what you're going to say next. And then you want to think about how can you communicate in, a narrative arc. And a good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This may be related to, a story of a finding that you help support. It could be your journey into science. It could be a composite of multiple experiences that you're putting together. But forming that narrative arc is definitely the hardest part of doing this, but is important for helping the information you're trying to convey actually be depicted in the form of a story. And then you want to explore the science and public health. So you might end the story with saying, this is why funding core facilities are important. And then this is what you can do with this information. Call your reps to ask them to support funding for NIH or whatever it is your call to action is. And I have a lot of examples of this on my Substack. So, for example, when the information came out about cutting indirect costs last year, I wrote an article that was essentially a composite story from people who I had talked to who were worried about the impact that that would have on their ability to do research overall. And I embedded that experience and that story into an overall newsletter narrative that conveyed what is it that an indirect cost is, why is it important to science overall, and what can the reader then do if they care about this. So a call to action of tell your representatives you don't want this to happen and those types of things. All right, I'm going to end there and have 15 minutes for questions. I know that was a lot of information. There's only so much I can cover in a talk of this length. But if you want if you want to talk more through your specific context or examples, feel free to email me and I'm happy to do that one-on-one. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and feel free to unmute yourself or pop questions into the chat.
I think I'm gonna jump in and ask a question since nobody's
Yes,
recognized.
please.
Um, First of all, I loved your talk. It was excellent. Really enjoyed hearing it. My question for you is, so I have no problem talking to people publicly. I have a really hard time trying to compose something for a social media post, right? So I don't, at all, which I would like to. Um, do you find that you need to tailor things differently depending on like LinkedIn versus Facebook? And I'm thinking more in terms of Facebook because my LinkedIn peers tend to be more scientists and my Facebook peers tend to be less sciencey and more the people I'd want to reach. Um, do you think you have to tone down your language? Not in terms of jargon, but in terms of wow factor, right? Does it feel less believable? Do you have to sound more neutral when you're making a statement in a mixed platform like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say no, because I think one thing that's really important is that people, like if you're excited about a picture that you took or a piece of data that you have, the excitement that people can have is contagious. So if you're truly excited about it, you should try to convey that excitement in whatever it is that you're communicating because that makes it more compelling. And it also, again, there's a really interesting thing that people trust people more than they trust scientists and institutions. And excitement and awe is a really, unique human experience. And you can inspire that in others. Um, so I would say the one caveat to that is, of course, you don't want to oversell what your results mean, right? It is important to be honest with what you do and do not know. But it is also okay to say, like, look at this beautiful image that I took, and this is why it excited me so much, right? Or however it is you want to communicate that. So I would say it's okay to be excited if you truly are excited, or whatever it is, that wow emotion might be.
Thank you.
All right, I have a question in the chat. Ah, that's a great question. Um, So Mira was saying how she's been communicating science online for about 20 years, and initially by explaining how science works and countering vaccine misinformation. Over time, I've realized that science communication has changed my own perspective too. For example, some arguments scientists often see as obviously positive, like publicly funded research, may not resonate with many people who are skeptical. Have you found that your own views or assumptions have changed? And you can read her full question in the chat if you're curious. So I will say that yes, my experience for sure has changed over time. And I will say that I definitely try to tailor my messages to the people that I'm trying to reach. And sometimes if I'm doing that online, it's based on assumptions, and those assumptions may or may not be true, which is why I try to have conversations with my followers. I try to have conversations in communities with the people that I'm trying to reach so that I understand what it is that they care about. One thing I didn't get to in this talk is that all of our beliefs and the things that we value are closely tied to our identity and, our community of belonging. So, particularly when we're talking about contentious topics that, like vaccines or even, unfortunately, just funding science in general sometimes these days, we have to understand that people are coming to this table to have this conversation with all of the values and all of the identities and all of the beliefs that, they've been exposed to since they were born, essentially. So oftentimes when I'm having conversations, first I lean into empathy and curiosity. So I understand, life is hard right now in a lot of ways, and I'm curious because I want to know what is it that they have heard? What is it that they're worried about? What is it that they want to know more about? How do they feel, dismissed or minimized by systems and institutions? Because asking those questions helps me actually be better able to communicate to them in a way that may resonate with their values and beliefs, because that is an important part of actually making the information, land better. Um, yeah, so I will say definitely I've learned a lot, and there is never a one size fits all, which makes this also really hard. Hannah.
Thanks, Liz. I loved your talk. I was wondering if you've experienced like communicating these sort of things with family or friends more challenging than with just, some kids in a public school or um, people who are non-scientists, but people that don't know you personally.
Yeah, I will always say that communicating to your friends and family is probably the hardest, and that is because they know you as, a baby and as a teen and as all the bad decisions you potentially made in the past before are now an adult. And that will potentially skew their willingness to, hear information from you. Plus, oftentimes you might have other complications with family members and you may not want to harm your relationship with them. So I will definitely say it is always harder for me to have these conversations with friends and family. That being said, I also feel like they have been the places where I can make great inroads over time. It just requires a lot of very careful maneuvering and patience. So, for example, I mentioned how I grew up unvaccinated. I vaccinated myself at 23. I am now 37. And it is just in the last 2 years that my mother has said she understands why the MMR vaccine is important, which was huge for her. And after my New York Times article came out, I had to, I had to approve it with her because she had to. The New York Times has a crazy fact-checking process, so she had to confirm on the record my remembering of those conversations we had. But after that came out, she told me, Liz, if somebody had treated you or treated me the way you were treated and the way you treat others, I probably would have made a different decision with regards to vaccinating you. And that's huge. It took over a decade for her to get to that point. And one thing I like to think about is I think about it as planting seeds along the way. I wasn't heavy-handed. I didn't get into debates. I would just plant seeds of, well, Owen was in was in the COVID-19 Pfizer vaccine trial, for example. So I planted a seed about that experience. Just she didn't love it, but like I just mentioned it in passing, and I mentioned this in passing, and then over time, I'm now seeing progress in ways that I frankly never thought I would. Um, that being said, if it's bad for your mental health and you don't have capacity, we should always preserve our mental health because then we won't, if we can't, we won't be able to do any other of the important work we do. So I don't necessarily think everyone can engage in this way, but those are the things I keep in mind. Any other questions? I will share slides. I will send a copy of those, and as I said, people can feel free to email me after if they would like. All right. If nobody has any other questions, it was great talking to you guys, and hopefully I get to see some of you again in the future.